This series is going to be about ASP.NET WebForms, which is an old framework for developing web applications on the .NET framework. WebForms was once popular back in 2002 when Microsoft introduced it for web development. But at this stage, there are more modern frameworks specifically for .NET, meaning WebForms would only be found in legacy applications. Towards the late 2000s, developers were already being encouraged to move away from WebForms and instead use MVC. So if you're starting a new web application project today on the latest version of .NET, there are a number of options that are more modern, and this diagram shown here would be most familiar to a lot of developers at this stage. So the options typically nowadays would be Razor Pages, MVC, or Blazor. Of course, there are a whole lot of other options outside of the .NET ecosystem, most of which heavily rely on JavaScript. These would either be some sort of JavaScript library or a full-on heavy SPA framework. Examples would be Angular, React, Vue. Single-page applications have been around for a while now. So these are fluid websites or applications that just give the impression of being fully loaded, just this one loaded application that doesn't have to do a lot of refreshing or submitting. Whenever you press a button, you have this post back that the page just keeps on refreshing. Just an example, and we're just going to use an AI chatbot to create a simple SPA. If we take this single page application and compare it with let's say a very old WebForms page, WebForms feels clunky, and every action you really have to wait for the whole page to load. When you press a submit, it's almost like everything has to be a refresh of some sort. So then, why is WebForms still being used today? What would be the reason? Very simply, this is just legacy applications that still need to be maintained. I mean, it's just important to keep in mind that it's not every web application that is going to be trendy, is going to be on the latest UI, or it's going to be sort of on the latest cutting edge modern designed language. There are still a lot of applications, especially ones that are internal and they're not public facing. Those applications need a lot of maintenance. So, I mean, it sounds very obvious, but typically with a lot of internal applications, a lot of investment has gone into them. A lot of time, you would have a team of about 5 to 10 developers over a couple of years, lots of lines of code. And what that application is doing is just doing a back-end admin job. This is not for branding or for advertising. It's just simply a line of business application. So it makes a little bit more sense to just maintain those applications instead of trying and going through the trouble of moving them to a modern technology where the only benefit you're going to get is just a fresh new UI. Just to drag this example a little bit longer, MVC is a completely different programming philosophy where the view explicitly by design is separate from the controller and the model. This is different from WebForms, which is you just simply create a page, but then the job of handling events and the logic is tightly coupled to this page. Now, Blazor is also very different from both MVC and WebForms. And the migration between technologies, it would typically involve just more than just front page or the UI, but it might involve a whole lot of rewrite of the actual business logic. And now just imagine an organization, you've migrated from WebForms to MVC at some point, let's say in the 2010s, and now having to migrate again to Blazor. So it might not be practical if the application is still doing a simple job. So for public-facing applications or websites that are, websites that definitely do need something new, like a new UI, a rewrite is going to be expected. You might be forced to sort of go through the trouble of doing the migration. Okay, so now WebForms, it was created to be a simple drag and drop framework for creating web applications. Around 2002, there were a lot of developers that were already familiar with desktop. A lot of them were creating applications on the desktop using WinForms. WinForms, not to be confused with WebForms, WinForms for Windows applications. So, as a quick demonstration, if we're going to create a WinForms application, which would only work on Windows, by the way, Visual Studio and Microsoft made it very, very, very easy for developers with a simple drag and drop. So we have a page, simply drag and drop any control, and any action is driven by an event. And there's also the concept of a code behind. Now, coming to WebForms, Microsoft just pretty much took the same concept and sort of converted it to for developing web applications. And many desktop developers could more or less get away without having to be very skilled in the basic web development concepts. So things like HTML, CSS, and maybe as to how the web page model is different from a desktop, because every action on the page is a refresh. But I mean, the benefit of web forms is that it's actually quite good for what it does. And if you were to use it correctly, without lumping your entire business logic on the code behind, it's actually a very good rapid application development technology. Very good. Given that most web applications of maybe let's say early to late 2000s were ultimately just simple forms that you would need to somehow save to the database. Web forms came with a lot of controls that worked. For just a simple CRUD, if you all you're doing is just have a form and then you creating, read, update, delete, that was more or less sufficient. And if we look at this quick little demo here, um, you just wanted a quick admin page. There's some sort of grid control, very quick way of saving to the database. Some limitations of ASP.NET Web Forms. Firstly, the technology is strongly tied to the Microsoft ecosystem, meaning applications would need Windows and IIS. Then the second issue is that Web Forms is not natively from the ground up. It's not a web development technology. It's more of an abstraction where the ASP.NET engine generates the HTML. Once you've dragged and dropped the control, the HTML is generated behind the scenes. The benefit, obviously, once again, is that it's drag and drop, but then also at the same time, it's a drawback because it's really just taking WinForms and then trying to force it to work within a web environment. But then the web and the desktop are not quite the same. So as time went by and then web applications were needing to be more interactive and a little bit more sophisticated, web forms is really just starting to fall a little bit behind. It just wasn't enough. The technology wasn't sophisticated enough to do a comprehensive modern app. So web forms is a very, very good abstraction of web development over the WinForms, and it does a very, very, very good job in being a quick application development or rapid application development tool. It works, it's important to stress that it works only on the very old .NET framework, of which the latest version is the last version of 4.8. It's also very heavily reliant on iOS and Windows, and for any new web application on the latest .NET. So on the latest .NET, not the old .NET framework, if you're starting a new application today, you are pretty much going to be forced to maybe, if you want something similar to web forms, look at Razor Pages. It's the closest front end technology to web forms. So once again, web forms is only a legacy technology, which is very good for internal, non-public facing applications. And those applications might be very, very expensive to migrate or rewrite. So that's why the technology is still sort of hanging around in some fashion. And many developers are sort of stuck with with needing to look after those applications, and that is why WebForms is still around.